Hi there, welcome to video number 2 for this learning module. We'll be covering characteristics of good content in this presentation. More specifically, here's what we'll be covering. First is the characteristics of good content, and then secondly, what isn't content strategy? So if we're going to cover what is content strategy, we should also talk about what content strategy is not. So first, let's talk about the characteristics of good content. I'm going to cover the characteristics of good content and actually use this as a means of introducing all of the class books. There will be 3, and each has a different perspective as far as what good content is and what content is and the actual development of content. But they contain many similar elements, and together they provide a very comprehensive view of what makes good content and how one actually creates that content. And we'll be working with these qualities to discover, review, and create content over the course of this term. So the first book that we're going to cover is not a book that's been assigned for this term. It's called Elements of Content Strategy by Aaron Kissane. It's a book that I've assigned in previous terms, but I only ended up using the book for this first week. So what I wanted to do was just go through the contents that I had used in previous terms, and that'll be it for this book. So like I said, it's not a book that you need to purchase or that you should have purchased. It is a good book, however, in general, and so I would recommend if you want to learn more about content strategy to pick it up. But like I said, I want to talk about some of the elements of content that this book has identified as being good content. So let's go through that now. The first quality that she mentions is that good content is appropriate, it's useful, it's user-centered, it's clear, it's consistent, it's concise, and it's supported. So let's go through those now. The first is appropriate. We want content that is relevant to our audience. This is a very utilitarian approach. It's very similar to dressing for the right occasion. You want to fit in, and you want to fit in with the norms and the culture of that specific group. In this case, we talked about what the user and the business are defined as in the last PowerPoint presentation. But once again, the user is the consumer, and the business is the person issuing and developing the content. And part of our strategy here is really determining what is right for the user or the audience and the business or the organization that's putting out the content. The author uses an example of James Bond. So here I have a picture of James Bond and Q. If you're familiar with James Bond, James Bond always has the right gadget at the right time and uses it in the situations to escape trouble. And Q, the inventor, always manages to anticipate the person's needs, Bond's needs, the right times and when he'll use them, and then creates that tool. The great thing is we don't need to mind read here. We can actually figure out what the audience or the user does need and create that, and we'll be talking about that in subsequent weeks and how to actually find out what the user needs and then how to develop content based off of those needs. The second one is useful. We can define useful as to define a clear, specific purpose for each piece of content. And what you want to do is you actually want to evaluate content against this purpose. To know if the content is right for the audience, you need to know what the content is supposed to be accomplishing. And so we need to have a clear definition of what purpose is in this case. And once we have that rubric for what purpose is, we can actually measure each piece of content against that to see if this will actually help or if this is going to hinder our cause. So when we create content, we need to have this specific qualification in mind. We want to evaluate content against its purpose. and see if it's worth the cost and the time to actually create this content, because while things like blog posts and things on Facebook are technically free, they actually take up a good amount of time and resources to be done correctly. So we actually always want to measure this. So here I'm going to lay out a couple ideas of what somebody might think a purpose is, and then ask actually, is this clear enough? Is this a good purpose? So first, one of the ideas for a purpose would be, listen, I just want to sell products. And that might be a moneymaker, right? But that's not enough of a purpose to create good and meaningful content around that purpose. So is it clear enough? We didn't really talk about who we're selling this to, what products, the goals, how many products we actually want to sell. So that might be a purpose as far as making money, but it's not a good enough defined purpose for our content needs. Sell this product. That's a little bit more specific. We've gone from products to this product, but it's still very grand, in the sense of how does somebody sell this product? We need to break this up into smaller bits here. Demonstrate the benefits of this product. That's better, but it still doesn't really actually give us any kinds of measurements. Who is this product for? Is this for everybody in the world? We really want to narrow in on our audience here. And finally, here's a last example of a purpose, and it's something that's really much better, is show how this product helps nurse practitioners or a specific audience. And with that, we're really zoning in on. And then we can see from each piece of content we develop, a blog post, ads, videos, does this actually help the cause? And if it doesn't, it might not be something that's worth pursuing. The next measure of good content is user-centered. You want to adopt, and here's a lofty term, the cognitive frameworks of your users, but more simply, you want to speak their language. And here's an example of something that isn't very user-centered. Back in 2004, when John Kerry was running for president, he had this very famous quote about a reference to funding a bill of the Iraq War, and he said, "I voted for it before I voted against it." In Senate speak, you can actually vote for a bill and then vote against it, but that wasn't really digestible to people who were going to vote for him. It wasn't user-centered, and so you really want to think about how a good politician speaks to an audience. You want to use language and tone that's appropriate for the people that you want to influence. So you want to get rid of insider lingo, and you want to use words and tone and definitions and speak like your audience does. Clear. You always want to seek clarity in everything that you do. We want something that's easy to use. Something that isn't is confusing because the ideas aren't expressed correctly. This means that we need to actually have others test and evaluate our content to make sure that it's, that what we're intending to do actually does come through. Consistent is another thing. Things should be uniform, but of course within reason. When things are consistent, it works on the psychological level. Users don't actually need to relearn or adjust to things. We've really created a framework for people to understand what's going on. So for instance, if I, in the next slide, completely change the font and the style and the colors of this presentation, it would actually inhibit your learning. You'd be forced to adjust every time. It'd be very jarring. Instead, we want language and tone consistency in all of our content. So we should always keep this in mind. Concise. You want to omit needless content. Less is more. We don't publish everything we can because we can, and it spreads us thin. We need to focus on what works well and do that well. So for here, I have an example of the iPhone versus a BlackBerry. Obviously, BlackBerry isn't doing very well right now. Apple was able to really omit
all of the needless buttons, all of the needless content, and create something that's streamlined and refined. And obviously, if you just look at the sales between these two products, you would see that it's certainly working. Good content is always supported. Content must always be maintained and supported. It's got to be nurtured, on the farm for it to bear fruit. You don't want to publish a blog with comments if you don't have a moderation or a comment policy. You don't want to start a Facebook page unless you have a plan to maintain it. And like this field, there's a famous Kevin Costner movie called The Field of Dreams. And the quote from that is, "If you build it, he will come." Sometimes people think that the web is kind of the field of dreams that, you could put things up on up online and it'll go viral and you don't really need to do anything. It's kind of the magic of the internet. If you build it, the audience is going to come. That's not really true online. If you build it, you really need to keep it maintained and supported, and really, it's got to grow. And you can help it to grow, and you should help it to grow. And a good content strategy and good content has that direction. It's not quite that flash in the pan kind of thing that I think people have misinterpreted the web as being. So now we're going to move on to our second book. It's called Clout. This is a really great book. I actually really enjoy this book a lot. The subtitle is The Art and Science of Influential Web Content, and it really talks about the art and science. And building content is both. So here's how in Clout good content is defined. It builds a reputation. It earns loyalty. It gets ahead of a crisis. It attracts the right people. It wins conversions. People actually follow through and sign up and do what you ask them to do. And it helps people decide. So let's look at all of these. For building reputation, every organization depends on a good reputation. Reputation is what people think about your organization's character. Online, content really helps to build that character. And you want to think about it as if you were building a character as a writer. What does the actual story you want to tell? But what are the characteristics you actually want to bring about? How do you want people to think about your brand? And then how do you actually make content in order to affect people so that they actually believe it and that they feel it? And good content always builds and supports your organization's character and your reputation. Earns loyalty. People who like you and trust you are more likely to give you the benefit of the doubt. Here I have an Apple fangirl, and no matter what Apple has had a couple crises here and there, but if somebody really believes in your brand and you've earned their loyalty, they're going to come to bat for you and they're going to defend you, and it's going to be much harder to influence their opinion in a negative way than somebody who isn't loyal to you. So how do you create content that actually makes people trust you and give you that benefit of the doubt in a crisis? So speaking of crisis, you want to create content. Good content actually allows you to get ahead of a crisis. Here I have a Warren Buffett quote, which is, "It takes 20 years to build a reputation and 5 minutes to ruin it." When a crisis happens, you'll have practice creating content quickly, and you'll have a public record online that people can actually dig through in the meantime while you respond or try to find the right response. You've practiced creating content, and you have an audience built in, and you have a pipeline to actually distribute that content when a crisis does happen. You don't need to just completely build right then and there. People will know to go to your website, or people will know to check your Facebook page. And so you want to establish that so that you do have the means and the mechanism to respond if something goes in the wrong. And no organization is free of this. There will always be things that can happen. So you want to have trained for that. Good content attracts the right people. Attracting the right people who meet your goals makes influencing their attitudes and actions much easier. If you want to sell the product to a group of people, you want to get in front of that group of people because they're more likely to buy that product. It's finding the right market, and you want to always go to that right market. Speaking of which, winning conversions. A good reputation and a good audience, the right people, actually helps to convince those people to act. And online we'll be talking about conversions a lot. Conversion just really means having people take a specific action that you want them to do. And it helps people decide. Influential content will help your audience make good decisions, the decisions you want them to make, or decisions that are healthy for them. Content strategy for the web. And here's how they define what is good content, or what is good content strategy, really. It meets the goal and it satisfies a need or a problem. It has a longitudinal view and an arc. It's not just that flash in the pan, it's actually what happens in the long run. And it sets benchmarks, and benchmarks are going to allow us to figure out if the content was successful and how to evaluate content, and how to improve content for the next time. So let's take a look at all of these. Meets goals and satisfies needs. It defines how you're going to use the content. Generally, we have to have a goal in mind, and the goal is to satisfy some need. The idea from the beginning is to define these to serve as a guide for content creation. Has a longitudinal view. A content strategy guides decisions about the content through its life cycle. And this is very similar to the principle that the other two books have talked about. And it sets benchmarks. Benchmarks need to be set so that you can properly measure the success of your content. Obviously, that helps you because you can determine if something was a success or not. But it also helps the cycle of content creation, because when you're able to set benchmarks from the beginning, you're able to see if it was successful or if it wasn't. And the next time you need to create more content, you'll know what is working and what's not. So over time, you'll perfect this art and science too, because everything online is measurable.
And finally, the last book that we're going to have in this term, but also a book that we'll be covering that really emphasizes what is good quality content, is a book by Jay Baer, and it's called Utility. It's definitely one of the best books that I've read about this in the last couple of years. And the approach that Utility takes is talking about how marketing has been done in the past and how marketing can be influential moving forward, and how content and how marketing should change in this new paradigm of marketing. So what he talks about as good, strong content is that it creates a quality called friend of mine awareness, and I'll talk about that in a second. It creates self-serve information. It has something he calls radical transparency. And it also has real-time relevancy. And what Utility says is that you can make your company inherently useful without expecting an immediate return. So how does that differ from previous marketing techniques in the past? Well, he says that the way to go moving forward is to create something called friend of mine awareness. This differs from two different marketing approaches that people had taken in the past. The first was called top of mind, M-I-N-D, awareness. And what that essentially is if you think about advertising in general, what you needed to do was create such an advertising level so that when people either wanted to make a purchase, or even before they even considered making a purchase, they would think of your brand. So think about all of that kind of in-your-face marketing, whether it's commercials, billboards. What they want to do there is plant a seed and actually create so many advertisements that you are essentially at the top of the mind, hence top of mind awareness. A second version of this that has gone, has become popular over the last, couple decades is something called frame of mind awareness. And what that essentially means is, if you think about when a person is about to make a purchase, how do you get in front of them as they're about to consider that purchase? So an example of this is something like a Google search ad, which essentially means as somebody is looking for purchasing a car, for instance, they will certainly Google, what are the car locations, to purchase cars or anything that they're considering purchasing at the moment. And something like a Google ad will allow you to be at the top of the list when people search for things. So they are in a frame of mind of purchasing. And how do you get to that point where you rise above everybody else when a customer is in the frame of mind of a purchase? The theme of utility is how do you create something called friend of mine awareness? And Jay Bayer's philosophy is to succeed, your prospective customers must consider you a friend. If, like their friends, you provide them with real value rather than simply a series of coupons, they will reward your company with loyalty and advocacy, the same way we reward our friends. And that theory permeates his entire book. So he gives 3 examples of how you would do that with content. So the first is something called self-serve information, and that essentially is the idea of giving people the opportunity to inform themselves how and when they wish, instead of giving them information funneled through the contact mechanisms of the company's choosing. And what he does is he says that in 2011, there's an entity called the Corporate Executive Board. They actually surveyed about 2,000 business-to-business customers, and they tried to uncover insights about the purchasing behavior. And what they found was that customers will only contact a sales representative after independently completing about 60% of their purchasing decision. That means that 60% of the decision is made before a prospect will identify himself or reach out before they make a call or an email to a sales representative. So that means that he says that customers are like ninjas now. They're evaluating everything right under your nose. And if you think about that, how many times have you been to a store or you see an item that you want to purchase, and then you research it before you make that decision? Before you spend your dollars, you want to make sure that A, it's the right price, and that B, it might be well reviewed. So he says that smart companies understand that by providing self-serve information and giving consumers the opportunity to find answers themselves, it isn't actually shrinking their duty as marketers, it's actually become their duty as marketers. So other qualities of this self-serve information include things like radical transparency. And the idea there is providing answers to nearly every question a consumer would conceivably ask before they ask it. So, or before they even think of asking it. So he gives a couple examples of this in the book. One example is a pool company that created a blog. The owner took questions that he had heard throughout the years and actually answered them and had different blog posts with different answers, whether they're pool features, how construction goes, anything that a customer had asked. He created blog posts in advance. So as a customer is looking for pools or places to install pools, what they will do is stumble across his blog post. And what that does is that builds trust. And when you have nothing to hide or you talk about things frankly, that creates trust. And you think about your friends and you think about your need to trust your friends. Another example he provides in the book is McDonald's Canada, which created a question and answer board. And when people are thinking more and more these days about fast food and what the quality of ingredients are in fast food, and it actually allowed customers to ask questions about the ingredients or the makeup of the food itself, where it comes from, and McDonald's Canada would actually answer them. And this is what he calls radical transparency, this idea that a company has nothing to hide, and therefore it creates this trust. And finally, it's the idea of real-time relevancy. And the idea of that is becoming massively useful at a particular moment in the life of a customer and then fading into the background until the next opportunity to help arises. And one of the examples that Jay Bayer gives in his book is something called the Vanderbilt Coach Smart application. And it was developed by 2 medical centers. One was a children's hospital and one was the Vanderbilt University Medical Center. And they created an application that's great for sports coaches. And what that does is it's available on mobile devices, and it's supposed to keep players safe. So one example of this is a lightning sensor. And if lightning strikes nearby, the app sends an alert to the phone and tells coaches what to do next. So whether they should cancel the practice, if it's outdoors. And what that does is if you are close to Nashville and if you are either a coach or perhaps a parent who knows that this application is keeping their kids safe, If you have an emergency or if you need a procedure done, then you're going to think about Vanderbilt University because they've helped you in the past. Additionally, it's being used nationally. So the idea there is, even though people might not necessarily be in Nashville, Tennessee, which is where Vanderbilt University Medical Center is, what you have done is your peers have recognized this application as being really, really effective. And you're getting kudos to your peer medical centers, and you're gaining a lot of credibility in that industry. And that's an example of how good content can provide real-time relevancy, being useful in a specific moment, and then that enhancing your credibility and this friend of mind awareness.
And then finally, what isn't content strategy? A strategy is an idea that really sets the direction for our future. And this book defines strategy as a lighthouse that can keep you headed in the right direction. So what isn't content strategy? Now, these are specific pieces of content, but this doesn't become content strategy. So a series of educational articles, a full-service online knowledge base, an employee blog post series, a new tablet subscription service, or social media accounts. These are all tactics. These are all ideas of how to create content, but it isn't an overarching vision for your content. It's very easy to make all of these, to set up a blog, to set up social media accounts. But like we said, it doesn't give you that direction. It doesn't give you that definition of what you need to achieve and something to measure all of your content against to see if this is a worthy piece of content for the goals you're trying to achieve. So we'll always be talking about tactics because those are the ways in which we produce content, and we'll be doing that. But what I want you to understand from the beginning is this is not a strategy. These are just tactics. And really to know the difference between tactics and strategy is what's going to set you apart in all of your work.